So, if you're in the market for a simple, budget-friendly TV, the Samsung AU8000 might be a good option to consider. Hi, I'm Brandon, a test developer at Ratings.com, where we help you find the best products for your needs. In this video, we're reviewing the Samsung AU8000, an entry-level budget TV in Samsung's 2021 lineup. We'll go through the test results to show you how it performs for various uses and give you the final score at the end. We'll start with how it performs for movies, followed by TV shows and sports, and then we'll talk about the gaming and PC use. Also, stick around towards the end as we'll be answering some of your questions as part of our Ask Ratings hashtag. We bought and tested the 65-inch Samsung AU8000, but it's also available in various sizes, ranging from 43 to 85 inches. We expect our results to be valid for all sizes. The AU8000 is the only non-QLED Samsung TV available in North America, but not in Europe. In Europe, there's a lower-end AU7000 and a higher-end AU9000. As usual, we're just going to take a tour of the TV before we get to the test results. Compared to last year's model, the TU8000, most of the changes to the design are on the back and in the stand. It still has a horizontal texture on the back, but it's now a lighter shade of gray. For cable management, there are tracks to guide the cables to the feet, and you can secure them with these clips. The feet look different from the TU8000, but they're not new. Samsung basically took the feet from the Frame 2020 and put them here. It's a lot thinner than the TU8000, so it's going to look great wall-mounted. It's all made out of plastic, which is to be expected for an entry-level TV, but the build quality is pretty decent. Being so thin and made of plastic, it's pretty lightweight for its size. For inputs, there are 3 HDMIs, 2 USBs, an optical audio out, a TV tuner, and an Ethernet port. There's no more composite input, so you'll need an adapter of some sort if you want to plug it in your older devices. It doesn't have any HDMI 2.1 ports, which is pretty normal considering it's a 60Hz budget TV, but it does support eARC on HDMI 2, which means it can send high-quality audio to an external sound system over HDMI. For the smart features, it's running a cut-down version of Tizen OS, but it offers almost all the same number of features as the higher-end models running on the full version. It's easy to navigate the interface, it runs fairly smoothly, and it offers a large selection of apps. The remote got a slight redesign, but unlike the higher-end models, it's still using disposable batteries. Voice commands work for things like changing the input or brightness and launching apps, but not for searching content within a specific app like Netflix. Before we get into specific uses, let's do a quick overview of the TV's overall performance. For movies and HDR content, it's okay. It's great for watching in a dark room because it has a high contrast ratio, but there's no local dimming or wide color gamut, and it just doesn't get bright enough for true HDR. For TV shows and sports, it's pretty decent. However, sports fans might be a bit disappointed with the motion handling. You also have to consider your setup. If you often watch in a very bright room, or if you have to watch TV at an angle, then it might not be for you because of the low brightness and poor viewing angles. For gaming, again, motion handling is not that great. It's a 60Hz panel with no VRR support. So it's decent for slow atmospheric games, but not fantastic for action games. And lastly, for use as a PC monitor, the AU8000 is good, but the BGR subpixel layout might be a deal breaker for some. Now let's move on to our test results, and we're going to start with the movies and HDR usage. Throughout the video, we'll compare it to the Samsung TU8000 to see where the improvements are on this new model. We'll also do a quick comparison with the Sony X80J and the LG UP8000 at the end. Okay, first on the list is contrast, and that's because it's one of the most important aspects of picture quality, no matter what you're watching. A TV with a good contrast ratio means it can deliver deeper blacks and is better at producing dark colors. It's more important if you watch movies in the dark, which we assume most people are. But even if you're in a bright setting, you're going to get better details in dark scenes. In this case, the AU8000 is using an MVA panel, which is the type of VA panel, so it has a great contrast ratio, measuring around 3800 to 1. It's better than the typical 3000 to 1 of most VA panels, but it's also far from the kind of contrast that we find on higher-end TVs, like the Hisense U8G, and also a downgrade from last year's TU8000. Blacks still look fairly deep, but again, there's no local dimming to improve contrast. Next up is the color gamut. Having a good color gamut means the TV can create a more lifelike image, and it's especially important when viewing HDR content. The AU8000's color gamut is better than the TU8000, but it's still not wide enough to meet our criteria to be considered a wide color gamut. You can see that it has a lot of trouble producing really saturated greens and blues. It's fairly well calibrated out of the box, but color accuracy can vary from one unit to another. The main thing we had to correct on our unit was a white balance. Now let's move on to HDR brightness. This is an area that's both unsurprising and disappointing because it just doesn't get very bright. It's slightly better than the TU8000, but it's still far from what's required for a true HDR experience. On top of that, there's some frame dimming in the 2% window, which means that small objects may appear dimmer. Looking at the EOTF, which is basically the gamma in HDR, we can see that it's undershooting the target brightness. So everything is too dark and you end up losing details in dark scenes. One area we do see a significant improvement over last year's TU8000 is the gradient handling, or how well the TV displays colors in gradation. The TU8000 had a lot of banding in the dark colors, but on this year's model, it's almost all gone. There's still a little bit in the reds and greens, but they're hardly noticeable, so you won't notice nearly as much banding in scenes with gradients, like a sunset. Since most movies are shot in 24 FPS, frame stutter can be an issue because of how long each frame is out. But here, it shouldn't be much of an issue. Stutter is usually more of a problem with TVs with fast response times, and that's not really the case here, as we'll talk about more in the next section. As for 24p judder, which is most notable in panning shots, the AU8000 can only remove judder from 24p sources and native apps. This means that you might see some judder if you're watching a movie through a game console, which outputs at 60 Hz. You can still use the motion interpolation feature to make motion smoother, but this can create the soap opera effect, which some people don't like. The motion interpolation feature works okay for slower scenes, but it stops working when there's a lot of action. So what's it like to watch movies and HDR content on the AU8000? The answer is, it's just decent. It's good for watching in a dark room because it has great contrast ratio, but the lack of local dimming and the low HDR brightness is where it falls short. Alright, so the first thing we're going to talk about is visibility. One thing to note here is that our scoring for TV shows and sports puts a lot of emphasis on the screen brightness and reflection handling, because we assume that most people watch these in a relatively well-lit room. Of course, that's not always the case, so if you tend to watch in a dark room, this doesn't apply to you. We've already talked about the brightness in HDR, and it's not much different with SDR either. It's bright enough for most lighting conditions, but it will struggle to overcome glare in a well-lit or sunny room. It's in the same ballpark as last year's TU8000. The same can be said of the reflection handling. It's great for a budget TV, but you might still see some reflections if you have the TV placed opposite of bright lights. If you tend to walk around or have a seating arrangement that forces you to watch TV at an angle, then you need to consider the viewing angles. Unfortunately, the AU8000 has pretty narrow viewing angles, which is expected for a VA panel. The gamma shifts the moment you move off center, so it's not the best choice if you care about image accuracy. Now let's move on to the response time. This is the time it takes for a pixel to change from one color to another, and it's important when watching fast-moving content like sports and video games. Like we mentioned earlier, the response time is just okay. Definitely a downgrade from the TU8000. You can see that it's very slow in the dark transition, and that's the reason you see this black smear. If you look close enough, you can also see the image duplication caused by backlight flicker. Speaking of, let's talk about the flicker because it gets kind of complicated. Technically, the backlight is flicker-free if you're in the movie picture mode with the brightness set above 25, which is good for those sensitive to backlight flicker. But it starts flickering if the brightness is set to 24 or below. The flicker frequency changes too depending on the picture mode. It flickers at 120 Hz if you have picture clarity turned on or in game mode. This can be disappointing to gamers as it means you'll get image duplication anytime you're playing games on this TV. It also flickers at 120 Hz in the dynamic, standard, or natural picture modes, but it will stop flickering in these modes if you have brightness set to the max. There's a black frame insertion feature that's meant to improve motion clarity. It can make the backlight flicker at 60 Hz for 60 FPS content, but the implementation isn't that great, and flickering can be bothersome to some people, so it's best to leave it off. So, to sum it up, the AU8000 is decent for watching TV shows and sports, although the black smear behind moving objects is noticeable and not ideal for fast movement. Visibility might also be an issue if you watch in a very bright setting, and depending on your setup, the narrow viewing angles might also be a problem. Alright, so let's see how this TV performs for gaming. We just talked about the response time and how it's not ideal for fast-moving content. Well, that applies to gaming too. You may notice black smearing or ghosting behind very fast-moving objects. Being a budget TV, it's a 60Hz panel, and there's also no variable refresh rate support to reduce screen tearing. So don't expect any super fluid motion here. That said, input lag is still outstanding and basically on par with monitors at this refresh rate. As for console compatibility, with the PS5 and Xbox Series X, it can only do 4K at 60Hz with HDR. So no 120Hz or 1440p support. There's an auto low latency mode, which means it'll automatically change to game mode when you launch a game from a compatible device. So overall, the AU8000 is decent for gaming. It's not bad for slower paced atmospheric games, but it's not ideal for fast ones that rely on twitch reflexes. As for the HDR part of the HDR gaming, it's not that great because there's no local dimming or a wide color gamut, and it doesn't get bright enough. If you want to use the TV as a PC monitor, there are just a couple of things to keep in mind. First, it doesn't support 1440p. This is not a problem if you're just going to be on the desktop, but if you want a game and your graphics card can't handle 4K, then you would have to drop the resolution down to 1080p. We tried forcing a 1440p resolution, but it just kept defaulting to 3840 by 1600, which is the same issue that we saw on other Samsung TVs like the Q60A. Second, it supports Chroma 444, which helps with text clarity, but it's also using a BGR subpixel layout. This layout won't affect image quality, but it might cause text fringing in some applications. You can always change Windows ClearType to account for this, but this doesn't work for apps that don't use Windows ClearType, like Google Chrome. So to recap, the AU8000 is good for use as a PC monitor. However, the BGR subpixel layout and the lack of 1440p may be an annoyance to some. You also have to consider the relatively low screen brightness if you plan to set it up in a well-lit room, which we've discussed earlier in the TV shows and sports section. One final thing before we get to our verdict, and that's the sound quality. They're passable, there's no low bass at all, and the treble drops off pretty quickly. It also doesn't get very loud, and there's a fair amount of compression and distortion at max volume. It's actually worse than last year's model, which may be attributed to the decreased thickness of the TV. Getting a soundbar would be a good investment here. So in conclusion, the Samsung AU8000 is a simple but decent budget TV for dark rooms, and it's well suited for watching TV shows and PC use. There's nothing really new here, it's just a slight upgrade from last year's TU8000. Compared to the Sony X80J, which is a TV in the same tier, the Samsung only scores better because it has a VA panel. Otherwise, the Sony is better, especially for watching sports, gaming, and PC use. It has better viewing angles, faster response times, and it gets brighter. It also has a flicker-free backlight and an RGB subpixel layout. The AU8000 scores better than the LG UP8000, another entry-level TV, but again, it's somewhat of the same story as the Sony. The LG uses an IPS-like panel with better viewing angles, but it really doesn't get very bright. It's even dimmer than the AU8000. It has better response times though, and it supports 1440p through a custom resolution. Now it's time to answer some of your questions. The first question is from Ray Wilson Garcia, and he asked us, does this TV support HDMI 2.1 or at least 120 Hz? Unfortunately, as we discussed in the review, the answer is no. It's a budget TV with a 60 Hz panel. If you want 120 Hz and VRR support, then you'll have to step up to Samsung's Q70A. The second question is actually from more than one person asking us to compare it to the Samsung Q60A. The answer is that they both perform similarly, but the Q60A has a much better color gamut because it's a QLED TV. It gets brighter than the AU8000, so it's better at fighting glare, and it can also get bright enough to give highlights and HDR content a little pop. The Q60A doesn't score as well as the AU8000 when it comes to response times, but it doesn't have as much of black smearing that we saw in the AU8000, which is caused by slow, dark transitions. So that's it. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.